When an avoidant man begins to emotionally shut down, most people make the mistake of assuming he doesn't care. But that's not always the truth. In fact, sometimes it's the exact opposite. Emotional shutdown in an avoidant isn't always a declaration of indifference. It can be a subconscious plea for safety, for control, for you to not walk away. You have to understand, avoidance isn't just a behavior, it's a defense system that was built in silence, brick by brick, long before you ever enter the picture. An avoidant who feels emotionally triggered or threatened by intimacy doesn't usually respond with emotional expression. He responds with withdrawal. But here's what most people miss. That withdrawal isn't peace. It's not clarity. It's chaos. It's a war zone behind his calm expression. And the more he shuts down, the louder the fear becomes in his head. He's not trying to punish you. He's trying to survive his own nervous system. He doesn't know how to say, I'm scared you'll leave. So instead, he makes you feel like he's already gone. But inside, he's screaming for connection. He just doesn't know how to ask for it without giving up the only thing that makes him feel safe, distance. You got to realize the avoidant brain associates closeness with danger. That may sound irrational, but it's rooted in lived experience. Somewhere along the line, usually in early childhood, love became conditional, unpredictable, or overwhelming. So the solution wasn't connection, it was control. It was isolation. It was emotional numbness. And now, as a grown man, he repeats that pattern like a reflex. Every time he feels close to you, something in him goes off. This is dangerous. This is too much. Back off. Not because he doesn't value you, but because the weight of intimacy feels like suffocation. So when he pulls away, goes cold, stops communicating, shuts down emotionally, don't be fooled into thinking he's indifferent. Often, this is the moment he's begging you not to leave. Without saying a word, the shutdown is a signal. It's a flare shot into the sky. It's his nervous system short-circuiting under pressure. It's the scared child inside the grown man yelling, please don't see how broken I am. Please don't leave me now. Now, this doesn't mean you should tolerate being stonewalled or emotionally manipulated. This isn't about excusing unhealthy behavior. It's about understanding the depth of what's happening beneath the surface. Because once you see the behavior not as rejection but as fear, you regain your power. You stop internalizing it. You stop blaming yourself. You stop chasing the shutdown and start standing in truth. That's when things shift. See, the avoidant is terrified of abandonment, but here's the irony. In his attempt to avoid being abandoned, he creates the very distance that pushes people away. He doesn't understand that his silence is louder than any argument, that his coldness cuts deeper than any insult, that by avoiding emotional intimacy, he's accidentally begging for it in the most painful way possible. Because the truth is, he wants connection. He's just never felt safe having it. So what do you do when you see the shutdown? You recognize it for what it is. You don't overextend. You don't chase. You don't try to pry open his walls. You let your silence hold your boundaries. But you do it with clarity, with strength. You show him through your calm and your distance that connection doesn't have to mean chaos. That intimacy doesn't mean collapse. That your presence is not a threat. And if he's ready to rise, to face himself, to finally confront the fear that's kept him running, he will. But you cannot carry him across that bridge. You can only build it from your side, solid, secure, and grounded in truth. If he's shutting down, it's not because you don't matter. It might be because you matter too much. And that's the part he doesn't know how to handle. So the next time an avoidant pulls away, don't just see the behavior, feel the wound. It won't excuse it, but it will explain it. And sometimes understanding is the first step toward healing, even if you heal by walking away. Because silence can scream. And sometimes the deepest cries for love are the ones buried in silence. Don't ignore them, but don't let them break you either. You ever notice how just when you start pulling back, he suddenly starts showing up in subtle ways? It's not always obvious. It's not a grand gesture, but it's there. He starts texting at odd hours, reacting to your posts, bringing up an inside joke you shared 6 months ago, talking about a random thing you once mentioned in passing. And it's easy to mistake this for progress, for growth. But here's the deeper truth. For the avoidant man, these sudden changes in behavior are not always signs of healing. They're signs of alarm. His nervous system just got hit with something terrifying. The possibility that you're really pulling away, that he may actually lose you. Avoidants don't beg with their words, they beg with their patterns. They don't knock on your emotional door and say, I miss you. That's too vulnerable. That's too exposed. Instead, they drop breadcrumbs. Strategically vague, emotionally safe, but just close enough to keep your attention, just close enough to make you question everything. And if you're not grounded in your power, you'll misread these subtle behaviors as signs that he's coming around. You'll interpret them as interest, as affection, as effort, but what they really are is fear. Think about it like this. Imagine a man who's built his identity on emotional independence, who's spent his entire life mastering the art of distance. For him, love is not security, it's exposure. So the moment you step back and stop feeding the connection, it doesn't just confuse him, it destabilizes him. It makes him question whether he really has control. And for someone wired to equate control with safety, that's terrifying. So what does he do? He doesn't chase. That would mean surrender. That would mean risk. Instead, he adapts. He shifts. He enters your space without fully entering your heart. He becomes present without being available. You start to see him comment on things he used to ignore. He asks questions he never cared to ask before. He starts engaging with you on a surface level, hoping that will keep the deeper bond intact. But it's not love, it's panic wearing the mask of presence. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't manipulation in the traditional sense. He's not playing games to hurt you. He's reacting to the threat of loss in the only way he knows how, by trying to restore proximity without restoring intimacy. There's a difference. He wants to be close enough to feel you, but not close enough to confront his own fears. And if you take that bait, if you return just because he showed a flicker of attention, you're entering a loop. You'll be back where you started, and worse, he'll feel like the strategy worked. This is what I want you to understand. When he starts showing up randomly, it's not always growth. Sometimes it's a nervous system response, a knee-jerk reaction to the fear of abandonment. It's him throwing emotional darts in the dark, hoping one of them sticks. And if you chase that moment, if you start reattaching just because he spent a late night thinking of you, you're reinforcing the very cycle you're trying to escape. And what makes this even more dangerous is how seductive it feels. After days, maybe weeks of silence, his small gestures feel massive. You're starving emotionally, so crumbs taste like a feast. But here's where you need to rise. Here's where your awareness has to become sharper than your longing. Because those sudden routine changes, that's not him stepping into emotional courage. That's him trying to reclaim control in a situation where you finally stopped giving it away. So how do you respond? Not with anger, not with instant affection, but with clarity, with boundaries, with the awareness that just because someone shows up doesn't mean they're ready. Just because someone reacts to your silence doesn't mean they're willing to match your depth. Sometimes you have to let people panic. Let them feel the absence of your energy. Let them sit in their discomfort without rushing to fix it for them. Because when an avoidant man shifts his behavior out of fear of loss, what he's really revealing is this. You were the one holding the connection the entire time. He just didn't realize it until you stopped. Don't confuse proximity with presence. Don't confuse activity with intimacy. And above all, don't confuse fear with love. One makes a man shift his habits temporarily. The other makes him change his life permanently. Let his panic be his wake-up call, not your invitation to shrink. One of the most confusing, disorienting moments in a relationship with an avoidant man is when he suddenly becomes passive-aggressive, cold, sarcastic, irritable, or just plain unpredictable. You find yourself asking, what did I do? Or why is he acting like this all of a sudden? But what you don't realize is that this behavior isn't about punishment. It's about panic. What looks like anger or frustration on the surface is, more often than not, a masked plea for connection. A twisted, defensive way of saying, don't leave me. See, avoidants aren't naturally skilled in expressing vulnerable emotions. They weren't trained to say, I'm scared I'm losing you, or I need more closeness, but I don't know how to ask for it. That would require emotional surrender. And surrender to someone whose core wound is loss of control feels like annihilation. So instead, they throw out emotional smoke bombs. They trigger tension. They criticize. They stir conflict, all while still staying connected enough to you that they don't actually lose access. But this is why passive aggression becomes their weapon of choice. It's a low-risk, high-impact strategy for maintaining a sense of emotional presence without having to be emotionally vulnerable. You see, for an avoidant man, direct communication is risky. It means admitting need. It means opening the door to rejection. But if he can stir your emotions indirectly by being vague, withholding, or unpredictable, then he still gets an emotional response without ever putting his own heart on the line. And make no mistake, he is looking for a response. He's watching carefully. Your frustration, your confusion, your emotional reaction, they're proof to him that he still matters. He doesn't need you to say, "I love you." He just needs to know you're still emotionally hooked. That's enough to regulate his fear for now. But this is where it becomes dangerous, not just for the relationship, but for you. Because if you don't recognize what's happening, you'll personalize it. You'll think you're the problem. You'll start over-explaining, apologizing, walking on eggshells just to avoid another emotional spike. You'll lower your standards to maintain his comfort. And every time you do, you teach your nervous system to accept emotional chaos as normal, even as love. That's where so many people lose themselves. And here's the truth most don't want to face. The avoidant isn't trying to hurt you. He's trying to protect himself. But in the process, he creates an emotional environment so unstable, so anxiety-inducing, that your own nervous system starts to burn out. You become the emotional container for his fear. You become the safe space for his unprocessed wounds, and over time, you start shrinking just to stay close. But closeness born from fear is not connection. It's captivity. When you see the passive aggression, the sarcasm, the cold jabs disguised as humor, understand this. That is his way of tethering himself to you without risking vulnerability. It's not love, it's survival. He's creating emotional friction to avoid the deeper fear of being abandoned. It's like setting off an alarm in the house just to make sure someone's still inside. The key is to recognize this behavior for what it is without reacting to it emotionally. The moment you begin to chase, to justify, to decode his mixed signals, you reinforce the dynamic. Instead, you respond with clarity, with self-respect. You hold your line. You don't play the game of emotional ping pong. You make it clear, not through confrontation, but through consistency, that you are not someone who can be emotionally baited. Because the real test is not whether you can survive his shutdowns, it's whether you can stay anchored in your truth while he tries to pull you into his storm. And if he truly values you, he'll feel the weight of your boundary. He'll see that emotional chaos no longer buys him connection, that the old tools don't work on someone who's finally woken up to her worth. So when he acts cold, critical, or passively cruel, don't internalize it. Don't chase it. Don't try to fix what was never yours to carry. See it as the symptom of his internal war. And know this, sometimes the most loving thing you can do for an avoidant is refuse to feed the fire he sets to keep you close. Because if he has to provoke you to keep you, he was never really holding you at all. Here's something few people truly understand. When an avoidant man goes silent, it doesn't mean he stopped caring. In fact, in many cases, it means the exact opposite. You may think he's done, emotionally checked out, moved on, disconnected. But often his silence is the exact moment his internal world is screaming the loudest. You just can't hear it. Because avoidants don't express their pain the way others do. They suppress it, they hide it. But make no mistake, they feel it deeply. An avoidant man's silence is not absence, it's surveillance. When he stops talking, he starts watching, not in an obvious or overt way, but in subtle, calculated ways that allow him to maintain emotional proximity while still guarding his pride. He might unfollow you, but still check your stories. He might never text, but suddenly react to a random post. He may not call, but you'll notice he lingers in your digital shadow because he wants to know if you've moved on without him. See, avoidants fear vulnerability, but what they fear even more is disconnection. Emotional detachment was something they learned to survive, but total abandonment, that terrifies them. They just don't have the tools to fight for connection directly, so instead, they monitor you quietly from the sidelines because as long as they're watching, they haven't really let go. Now, here's what makes this dynamic even more psychologically rich. During this silence, he tells himself that he's in control, that he's doing the rational thing, that pulling away is strength. But as the days go by and he sees you thriving, healing, glowing in your independence, that illusion of control starts to crack. And what replaces it is something even more uncomfortable for him, doubt. He starts wondering if he made a mistake. He starts overanalyzing your posts. He begins looking at the version of you he once had access to and realizing that maybe, just maybe, you're slipping out of reach. But even then, he still won't reach out directly. Because to him, vulnerability is weakness. So he chooses the lesser threat, silence. He holds on to distance as a last defense, not realizing that every second of that silence is pushing you further into your power. It's a paradox. The more he pulls back to feel safe, the more he realizes he's becoming irrelevant in your life, and it terrifies him. But instead of expressing it, he doubles down on the quiet, because that's his comfort zone, that's his armor. He believes that if he says nothing, he loses nothing. But what he doesn't realize is he's already losing everything, silently. This is why silence in the world of avoidance is rarely ever neutral. It's loaded, it's heavy. It's strategic, yes, but it's also desperate. It's the emotional equivalent of watching you through glass and hoping you turn around first. He doesn't want to reach out. He wants you to break the silence so he can feel safe again without having to be vulnerable first. But here's the hard truth. Every time you break that silence first, you reinforce his belief that he doesn't need to change, that he can pull away, go cold, disappear, and you'll always be there waiting to warm him up again. That's how the cycle survives. That's how he keeps 1 foot in and 1 foot out, all while never confronting the fear that drives it all. So what's the move? You stay silent too. Not as a game, not as a manipulation, but as a declaration. You're done translating his silence as something you need to fix. You're done interpreting his distance as your responsibility. You're done letting someone's inability to communicate steal your peace. Because eventually, if he's truly watching, he'll feel it. He'll feel the shift. The emotional thread he once took for granted will start to fray. And if he cares, if he values you beyond his fear, he will be forced to make a choice. Evolve or evaporate. But that's not your burden to carry anymore. Your job isn't to decode the silence. Your job is to own your voice, your presence, your healing, without needing someone else to validate it through breadcrumbs. Because if he's silent while watching you disappear, he's not just afraid of losing you, he's hoping you'll rescue him from facing his own emotional reflection. Don't let his silence be the mirror, not your prison. Something remarkable happens when an avoidant man starts fearing he's lost you. He begins to mirror you. Not because he's manipulating you and not because he's suddenly fixed his emotional wiring. No, it's far more primal than that. When an avoidant feels the distance growing and senses that your presence is no longer guaranteed, he doesn't know how to express that fear with language, so he does what's instinctual. He mimics what once made him feel close to you. You'll see it in his tone, in the way he echoes your phrases, starts using your metaphors, engages with your interests. All of a sudden, he's picking up books you love. He's referencing songs you once played on a long drive. He's even using your words back to you in conversation, as if subconsciously trying to recreate a version of himself that matches your energy. And it's not always deliberate. In fact, in most cases, it's unconscious, but that doesn't make it any less real. At the core of this behavior is a psychological survival strategy, a deep ingrained pattern of trying to belong without becoming vulnerable. He doesn't know how to say, I miss how close we were, but he can reflect what closeness used to look like. It's his way of saying, see, I'm still connected to you. I still remember. I still care. But it's all happening in this emotionally coded, indirect language because direct intimacy is still far too unsafe for him. What's fascinating is how subtle this mirroring can be. You may barely notice it at first. A change in how he texts, a sudden interest in something you mentioned months ago, a specific phrase that sounds eerily familiar. These are not coincidences. These are emotional breadcrumbs. He's tracing back the path to the version of you that once made him feel secure without ever having to admit that he's afraid of losing it. And here's where most people misunderstand this shift. They assume it's change, growth, progress. But you have to be careful, because mimicking you is not the same as becoming emotionally available. It's a reaction, not a transformation. A temporary signal of attachment panic, not a sign of evolved intimacy. He's not meeting your depth, he's copying your light, hoping it keeps him warm. You see, an avoidant will often reach for familiarity when threatened with emotional abandonment. He doesn't necessarily want to change who he is, he wants to recreate what worked before you started pulling away. It's a shortcut to connection without having to tear down the emotional walls he spent years building. But connection without authenticity isn't connection. It's performance. And sooner or later, the mask cracks. So what do you do when you start seeing this, when he starts reflecting back to you? You pause, you assess, you don't fall into the fantasy of he's finally coming around. You ask, is this behavior consistent? Is it grounded in truth? Is he showing real vulnerability or just emotional mimicry? Because here's the truth. A man who's truly transforming doesn't copy you. He meets you, he grows beside you, not by becoming you, but by becoming himself in a way that aligns with the relationship. If you jump back in too fast, if you mistake imitation for intimacy, you'll fall right back into the loop. You'll think he's stepping up, but really, he's just stepping around vulnerability. And in time, the behavior will fade. The mimicry will dissolve. And you'll be left holding the weight of expectations he never had the tools to carry. This is where your power comes in. You don't respond to mimicry with emotional investment. You respond with observation, with grounded presence, with self-awareness. You let him show whether this is a pattern or a pivot, whether he's anchoring into real emotional growth or just reacting to the fear of losing your energy. Because if a man only starts mirroring you after you pull away, he's not connecting, he's clinging. He's not rising, he's reaching. And as much as you may want to see the good, to believe in the change, you must stay aligned with truth, not fantasy. When he starts becoming what he thinks you want, ask yourself, is he finding himself or just fighting to not lose you? Because love that starts with imitation rarely survives without transformation. There's a moment in every dynamic with an avoidant man that feels like a glitch in the pattern. A moment where he suddenly shows you parts of himself he once hid, where the cracks start to show, where the polished front starts to erode. And it's not random. It's not accidental. It's deliberate. It's quiet. It's vulnerable in a language that isn't loud. And if you're paying attention, you'll see it for what it truly is. His way of begging you not to leave without using words. Avoidants don't often reveal their flaws, their insecurities, or their chaos. Why? Because control is their armor. Image is their currency. The ability to seem unbothered, untouchable, self-sufficient, that's what makes them feel safe. They're terrified that if someone sees their real emotional mess, they'll be rejected, exposed, or abandoned. Vulnerability to an avoidant is not a door to connection, it's a threat to survival. So when an avoidant starts letting his flaws leak out, even subtly, it's not weakness, it's intention. He's testing the water. He's showing you just enough to see if you'll still stay. It might look like a confession, masked in humor, a story from his past, shared with a laugh, but hiding deep wounds underneath. A moment where he admits he's overwhelmed, confused, unsure. And he might brush it off right after. Say it's no big deal, make a joke, change the subject. But don't miss the signal. That moment wasn't small. That moment was a door creaking open. It's in those flashes, those micro moments of emotional exposure that the avoidant is telling you, this is who I really am. Can you still accept me? It's a test, but not the manipulative kind. It's a survival mechanism, a last-ditch attempt to be seen without falling apart. Because deep down, the avoidant man wants intimacy. He just doesn't trust it. He doesn't trust that he can be fully known and still be fully loved. He doesn't trust that closeness won't cost him his dignity. So instead of saying, I need you, he shows you his pain and watches what you do with it. But here's the paradox. Even though that moment is real, raw, and deeply revealing, it doesn't always lead to lasting change, because if you rush in too quickly, if you over-nurture, over-explain, over-promotion in response to his subtle vulnerability, he'll panic. He'll feel exposed, and he'll pull back. That's the trap. You see his cracks and you think it's an invitation to heal him, to rescue him, to love him harder. But that's not what he needs. What he needs is space to hold his own vulnerability without retreating. He needs someone who can witness his truth without immediately trying to fix it. He needs the strength of your stillness more than the intensity of your reassurance, because only then does he learn something his nervous system was never taught, that love doesn't require performance, and that being seen doesn't have to mean being judged.